Good afternoon, all. I'm Ann MacDonald. I'm the Managing Director of Political Risk at Edelman Global Advisory. And we've been participating in a series of midterm 2022 discussions around the topics that are most important to voters, as shown in the polls. Last week, we dug into economic security and pocketbook issues that are polling by far as the most important issues to voters. But as we move into what some of the issues are that swing voters are more interested in, and what the voters who might change the tenor and outcome of some of the elections that are being most highly contested are, we are turning today to look at safety and security, and are so happy to be joined by our Edelman Global Advisory Senior Advisor, former Mayor of Philadelphia, Michael Nutter, as well as John Bash, the former U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas. Thank you all very much for being with us. Today on the safety side, we're going to look at Americans' perception that crime is steeply rising, and the emphasis that many politicians are putting through their midterm ads and election campaigning on that issue, as well as major issues around gun violence and school shootings and more broadly mass shootings. And we're also going to look at, on the security side, what we're looking at in terms of immigration and where we are currently, as well as what prospects might be for any compromise on the other side of the election. But we'll start, Mayor Nutter, going to you, and really wanted to see, as I just mentioned, that as we come into this final closing week before the midterms next Tuesday, and we do hope everyone is registering to vote and getting out where they can. But we want to look at, we saw in both a poll that Gallup put out last Friday, as well as a Pew study that came out yesterday, that Americans are feeling, and the Pew poll said 61% of Americans are seeing crime as a top concern in this election cycle. We're seeing this rise in perception of Americans feeling like we're more insecure and that public safety is decreasing. But can you paint the picture of why we might be feeling this insecurity and versus the reality? And what are we seeing in the political ecosystem around this too?
Sure, Anne, thank you, and John, great to be with you. I think this is the great conundrum of kind of facts versus reality. If you look at FBI statistics or the Bureau of Justice Statistics Office, the numbers will tell you that overall violent crime is no different in 21 than it was in 20. And actually, in some instances, that aggregate number is actually lower than pre-pandemic levels. Here's the problem. If you go back to 2020, the murder of George Floyd, protests in the streets, at times violent, which is never to be condoned, protests all day long, violence not acceptable, destruction of property, and the like. And Americans, for the most part at that time, were literally stuck in their homes and had to pretty much watch all of this play out, not only on TV, but in many instances, possibly in their own neighborhoods. And so, that's the story of 2020. 2021, somewhat different, nowhere near as much on-street activity. The mass shootings, killings have continued to escalate, if not rise over time. And then there's the day-to-day, sadly, the day-to-day violence, shootings and murders that take place. And so overall, if you put all the stats together, violent crime, no different than the last 3 years. But homicides and shootings are up significantly. And in some cities that started before the pandemic, only to get worse during when the pandemic started, and I don't think we're out of it yet, but still an ongoing basis. Last, yes, elected officials do bear some responsibility for this. Republicans want to talk about crime and violence in cities that are mostly run by Democrats versus the mass shootings, which in many instances take place in rural or suburban areas, often run by Republicans. All of which is to deflect attention from one of the worst violent activities, which was the insurrection of January 6th. Over 100 police officers injured badly. 5 people, I believe, died. And so this is all deflection and trying to push all of this narrative on the Democrats when Republicans have actually been in charge, at least in the White House, for 4 of the last 6 years.
Thanks, Mayor Nutter. John, I'll let you react to that a little bit, and also want to talk about in your experience as the U.S. Attorney for West Texas, you were over the El Paso shooting. That, while not a school shooting, of course, you also had many other mass shootings in the district since then. But given your experience with that type of horrific crime, and we also saw in the Gallup poll that by a margin of 2-1, the crime that people are most interested in and most worried about for their own safety is crimes against their children in school shootings. What potential options do you think we might see in a Congress if it does flip Republican? And why do you think these messages have been so resonant throughout this campaign?
Well, thanks, Ann, for having me on, and it's really an honor to be with Mayor Nutter. And I'll actually start in the first set of issues, which I think we actually have a lot of agreement on. I don't know if I'm supposed to disagree with them, but I agree.
There'll be time for that.
I do think the 2020 period, where there, as the mayor said, peaceful protests during the day relating to the George Floyd killing, but then violence in the streets at night in many major U.S. cities, was transformative for a large part of the country, certainly for conservatives, but for a lot of middle of the road people. I spent a lot of time in South Texas, which is a heavily Latino area. My wife's from there, so we're down there a lot. And I think it made a big difference there. It looked like the police were just not doing their job because they didn't want to offend sensibilities. And that may have been a misnomer. That may have been unfair, but I think that perception really stuck. And then I think Democrats didn't do themselves any favor because a segment of Democrats, not people like Mayor Nutter and more centrist folks, but a segment started doing defund the police, which took on outsized significance in the debate. And most regular people, even if you're a Democrat, you're listening to that defund the police when we're having violence in the streets. I think we need to give them more funding to be better trained how to deal with volatile situations, not less funding so they're more stressed out. I mean, it just made no sense to most people just looking at it a common sense perspective. I mean, defund the police is like defund teachers. I mean, let's not have teachers anymore. It just didn't make any sense to people. And I think that really led to a perception that Democrats were very soft on crime and anti-police. And then the Republicans, of course, picked up on that in their arguments and said, look at these people. And when you saw a level of increase in crime, maybe it was just the worst crimes, but still, I think that, that ended up shaping the debate, even if the more recent statistics don't bear out that there's a significant increase in crime. I'll also say this. I don't think regular people sit there as much as news reports would suggest and think about relative differences. Certainly people aren't thinking, well, crime was a lot higher in the 90s 30 years ago, and so I'm good now. I mean, they're thinking about what they saw in the local news tonight. They're thinking about the school shootings. They're thinking about, when I was living in DC, first night my neighbors moved in, and this was a pretty nice neighborhood. First night my neighbors moved in, the Chinese delivery guy was held up at gunpoint. They're thinking about those incidents. They're not thinking about, well, it could be a lot worse if I was living in New York in the 80s. I mean, so the relative changes, I think they're thinking about the absolute level. Right. And they're looking around and they're saying this feels unsafe. And you add the defund the police rhetoric, and it becomes a big issue and probably one that helps Republicans in the upcoming election. On school shootings, I don't think anyone would be surprised if you did a poll question and one of the options for what are you most concerned about is like the safety of your kids, that most people would say yes. I mean, the problem is that people have very different views about what the policy solution to that. So I'm skeptical that will drive election outcomes, because some people, of course, think massively higher gun control or gun safety legislation is necessary. We need to ban semi-automatic weapons, gun registries, and all that stuff. Other people think that's crazy. You're taking guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens and leaving only the criminals with them. We need to protect our schools better, single entry points, and all these ideas that Republicans advance whenever there's a school shooting. So I'm just a little skeptical that that's actually going to drive people to the polls, just because I think people are divided on which party they think would better address school shootings.
Yes, and I think, we have polls that show that among voters that rank gun safety as their top issue, neither Democrats nor Republicans are winning. But I'd love to hear, from. Go ahead.
And just on that point, and I'm getting nervous now that that there's a little too much of a love fest here between John and I. We're going to have to really mix this thing up. I'm going to have to go into another mode. But, the reality is that we can't really, we seemingly cannot have a serious discussion about gun safety. I don't talk about gun control. I talk about gun safety. In Pennsylvania, right, we have a serious gun culture, primarily in the western part of the state. It is familial. It is father to son, father to daughter, mother to son, right? I mean, children are raised to understand what the weapon is, the power of the weapon, the safety that goes with it. And they are hunting, they're shooting, skeet, they're, pheasant, deer, whatever the case may be. That's all. That's legitimate. I'm not worried about those folks. I'm not worried about grandpa with a shotgun. Grandpa probably knows what to do with that shotgun. In the eastern part of the state, it's a totally different situation. We represent about 12, 13% of the population. We probably have half of the murders possibly in the state. So that weaponry is used to kill people. So only. There's no deer hunting generally in Philadelphia, right? So you can't seemingly have a legitimate conversation about gun safety in America because everyone immediately goes to their corners of defense and they stay there. John and I could probably have a serious conversation about it and might even reach some level of agreement. But, we're only 2 of the 330 million Americans. So, we got a long way to go.
I echo most of that. I think here in Texas, obviously there's a huge gun culture. And I have 2 guns, even though I don't really consider myself a huge gun guy, but I have 2 handguns for protection. I think a lot of law-abiding citizens who are gun owners feel like, why am I going to be penalized because other people are misusing firearms? I feel like it's important to protect my family to have a firearm. And because other people commit crime, I'm going to be penalized. And
John, what's the penalty? Again, I'm not worried about you. I mean, you're a law-abiding citizen. Even gun owners. I mean, people who seriously identify themselves as gun owners think that there's something wrong with what's going on, and what's wrong with it. Heightened background check. I mean, if you walk into a store, is there really a difference between I can buy whatever I want right over the counter in 20 minutes? Or maybe I have to wait 3 days to see if I'm, sane enough or if there's some concern about my situation. If you just have to have it today, I would really start to wonder, like, what in the hell's going on?
Yeah, I think they feel like, why can't we just have an instant check? Why should I be burdened in any way in the exercise of my rights? Because other people are doing bad things. You make a fair point. It's not.
Well, if we would upgrade the NICS system, we might be able to have instant check. But we've also seen people get through it.
I think that you're right. You're right on updating NICS. By the way, I agree with you on that. I always kind of analogize it to the Fourth Amendment, which of course protects people's privacy in their homes. And you could imagine a different world where people say, "What's the big deal? We'll have a police officer step in your home for 5 minutes and look around and make sure there's not weapons or drug paraphernalia or evidence of crime. It's not a big deal. Can't use it for anything else. Why do you object to somebody coming into your house for 5 minutes for that purpose? We're going to save lives." And I think most Americans on the right and the left would say, even though it's a sort of an abstract value that I don't want some police officer snooping, that's my right. That's my privacy right, not to have the government interfere with my home. And I think a lot of gun owners, although I know people on the left don't even think in these terms, but I think a lot of people on the right think, this is one of my fundamental rights as an American to protect myself. And I want to go get a gun. I feel like I need it today. I feel like my family is threatened. I've never done anything wrong. I'm not a criminal. Why am I being held up? They should enforce the laws on the books that prevent felons from getting guns. Of course, your response is going to be, well, that's what we're trying to do when we do the background check. Right. I see where they're coming from. Background check laws is never something that has bothered me as much as some of the other proposals on the table. But I get, just like as most Americans would react to the Fourth Amendment proposal, I understand where gun owners are coming from, where they don't think any interference in their rights could be permitted.
That's helpful. And I think if we could just round out this part of the conversation by getting both of your perspective on, is there a possibility of a place for compromise? I know that after Uvalde, we thought that maybe this would be the time. Maybe there is more fervor around this on all sides and more energy to get a positive move on legislation going. What do you all think could be a possibility in the next Congress, if anything, for compromise?
Well, here's a novel idea. You would probably need about 260 between the House and the Senate. You probably need about 260, 270 members who literally were not going to run again, who knew they would never face the voters again, to actually do something. Because there is so much fear, certainly on the Republican side, of doing anything. I mean, this is, we've got the whole slippery slope. We're doing background checks today, and 5 officers are going to show up in your house next week and take everything you have. I mean, obviously there's no connection, between those two, and slightly facetious kind of argument, but that's the whole slippery slope, kind of thing. If you ever give an inch, they're absolutely taking a mile, and it's a trust issue. And so, I mean, look, I'm an optimist always. I'm hopeful. Incremental progress is better than none. And there was something passed not too long ago, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, I do think gun owners feel like if you give an inch, you're not going to get anything back. And 5 years from now, they're going to be saying that didn't work either. And now we're going to take another inch. And that's hard to overcome. I mean, one possible way to deal with that is to give gun owners something in return, and say, you're giving an inch, but you're also getting an inch. So, for example, forced reciprocity, where if you are a law-abiding gun owner in one state, you have the right to do that in other states too, or something where law-abiding gun owners actually can be easier for them to have firearms, but they're giving up something in terms of more delay on background checks or those sorts of issues. I rarely see gun reform proposals that go for that approach, where it's, we're going to give the law-abiding gun owners some new benefit, some new freedom, while constraining them in some way that we think will prevent crime. I don't know. I'm not enough of an expert on those issues to know what a proposal makes both political and policy sense. But it seems like people could think about kind of triangulating compromise more than they do on these issues.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is also just, again, it's the fear factor. I mean, we saw, was a congressman in New York who, in the aftermath of the Buffalo mass shooting, said that he could support prohibition on AR-15s, and within a week, after just being pilloried by fellow Republicans, literally announced that he was not running for re-election. This is someone who was up for election. And so, I mean, it's not just the voters. I mean, it's the pressure that comes from the political players is so intense that, even people have, I mean, it was in his city. I mean, any elected official facing that kind of situation, I mean, if you have to talk to those parents, if you have to see, any of those crime scenes, it's just going to tear your heart apart, and you feel compelled to do something. And so the guy says he could support, AR-15 is not like a Glock, right? So, and within a week he was done.
That's fascinating. And Mayor Nutter, I want to turn us now to just more proactive public safety initiatives outside of the gun conversation. And as John mentioned, Democrats have been pilloried for the defund, which we know was a horrible messaging. Or of course, there are some. I think
slogan,
Democrat friends agree with me.
Slogan, horrible message. I mean, it's just the worst communication ever.
Yeah, and so
no sense.
And now that Democrats are being hit on this so hard, where are the proactive places the Democrats are going in the midst of these Republican attacks to demonstrate that they do want to address these concerns?
Well, I think the interesting thing is, again, if you go back to the numbers, I mean, some people did actually take action, or, a little bit of budget wizardry. They, took some dollars technically from the police department and then put it over in social services, or moved it somewhere else. So, could they legitimately, with maybe a nod and a wink, could they say that they took some money from the police? Yeah. Did it go somewhere else? Yes. For other good purposes. You will find in most of those cities, subsequent to that, many of them increased funding for the police beyond what it was when they took the funding away, or they have upgraded their systems such that there is a better or closer relationship between the public safety officers and social service personnel. In many instances, we are asking the police to do things or respond to incidents for which they are actually not that well trained. Whatever happens, if the three of us walked out in the street right now and something happened, there's about a 9.9 out of 10 chance we're going to call 911. And so a trained professional with a gun, a badge, handcuffs, maybe a taser, and a baton is going to show up to deal with almost anything that we call them for. When in many instances, what you actually need is a social service worker or a suicide prevention person or a homeless outreach individual. A man standing in the street with his shirt off, screaming at the top of his lungs, I don't know if that's like for a police officer. What are they going to do with him? You know, I mean, so there are other parts of the government that really, you know, the public sector that need to be involved in these issues. And so in many instances, we're just asking them to do things that they're not even trained or qualified for. And they're the last resort before we've, you know, exhausted other options. So we see more of that kind of collaboration, coordination in many of the cities. John talked earlier about, you know, the police officers, public safety officers need more training, need de-escalation training, defensive, you know, kind of, you know, hand-to-hand tactics, if you will, and a variety of other systems that need to be upgraded, full body camera operations, and things like that that have nothing to do with, you know, when they first show up on the scene.
Yeah, I mean, just to start with the defund the police, I mean, it's got to be the least politically astute major slogan in recent memory. I mean, there's no body of voters outside the far left that would respond to that in any way. It sounds just almost inconceivable to most people that the idea of what we should do to make our communities safer is to defund the police. And I doubt there's any real constituency for that beyond college campuses. And I think that the tragedy of it is that, as the mayor was saying, I mean, we probably need more funding of police and other workers who specialize in certain sorts of situations that recur regularly. You know, part of the problem in there's a lot of these encounters where, you know, some of the encounters the police officer clearly acts incorrectly. Some of them the citizen clearly acts incorrectly. But there's a lot of them where there's obviously just a huge degree of mistrust and miscommunication, and it spirals out of control. And the solution to that is to have police officers that know their communities better, which really requires more police officers for stopping, or where the person who stopped doesn't just have an entire memory file of bad interactions with the police that they draw on as soon as they see the sirens, and all of a sudden have a reflexive mistrust about what's about to happen that leads to these horrible miscommunications. And it wasn't only the defund the police just doesn't make sense that direction, but really we need more funding, more training for the police, and also these other social services folks that help prevent violence. So it was crazy. You know, President Biden very conspicuously did not embrace that in any way and clearly rejected it. He's a very savvy political veteran and obviously understood that was a loser. But I think they've abandoned that now, as far as I can.
Yeah, I mean, you don't hear very much about that. John, you froze a couple of times, but I heard something, and I want to make sure I heard it well, and I think I did, but I do want to comment on it. I think you were talking about people who get stopped by the police, and you know, may have some bad memories, or had a bad experience, and that you know, I mean, I have to tell you right here in this conversation. I mean, I'm 65 years old. Born, raised, educated, created all my trouble here in Philadelphia. And when I'm driving my little Mini Cooper, if the lights and sirens go off behind me, I get nervous. And the reason is, and I mean, I've never been in any trouble, never been arrested, nothing, right? But you know, it's often just not a good experience. It's not pleasant. And sometimes it's frightening. And we've seen, and because we've seen so much, you know, the videos and the YouTube and the camera phones and all of that. I mean, we've seen some situations that should not have gone badly go very badly. And so you literally just don't know. I mean, I was stopped recently, a couple months back. I mean, I know the rules. Hand on the steering wheel, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, don't move. Now, I'm 63 years old in a Mini. What do you think I'm doing?
And hopefully they know you from TV there, sir.
What'd you say?
And hopefully they know you from TV, sir.
Well, actually, these officers appear not to know me. So, but
Unbelievable.
But it shouldn't matter, right?
It shouldn't.
I was a block and a half from my house. I was mayor for 8 years. I was a councilman for 14 and a half in the same district. And it was an uncomfortable experience. I've got one person asking me questions. I've got the other guy on the passenger side, a flashlight and his hand on his weapon.
Unbelievable.
So imagine if you're 23.
Not you.
And maybe you've had some previous contact with the criminal justice system. Maybe you have a prior or two or whatever, right? That's probably wasn't a good experience then. It may not be a good one today. And so what you end up having is both parties afraid of each other.
That's right.
The person who's stopped, black, white, purple, they're nervous. The officer is nervous. Car stops are one of the most dangerous encounters other than domestic violence cases. Car stops are one of the most dangerous encounters that law enforcement can have, because you don't know, A, what that person is going to do. B, you don't know what they have. And so they're kind of on offense and you're automatically on defense. And so that's why a lot of those encounters really go badly. But I mean, there is a reason people are very nervous because of the things that they've seen. Yeah,
and I'll just add to that, really, the mayor mentioned at the end there, you know, not only the citizen, but the officer is bringing with him or her a memory file of the one time out of 200 stops when someone did pull a gun, or hearing about your buddy on the force who was shot because they gave the citizen the benefit of the doubt when they were reaching for the wallet and it turned out to be a gun. And it's just, it's just very hard logistically in those situations. I mean, if you just think about putting yourself in that, it's hard to know. You're asking someone for the wallet. There's a chance they have a gun. It's not a high chance, but there's a chance. Right. And if it is a gun, you're going to have to react in a half a second or you're going to get killed.
Right.
Those are very challenging. But again, I think more funding, more trust, more understanding the neighborhood, it helps both sides, I think. I mean, if an officer knows who somebody is, that's a different situation. If the citizen is used to dealing with officers in ways that aren't hostile, that's a different situation. Yeah. So that's why, to me, the defund the police, besides just being politically boneheaded, was so pernicious as an actual policy situation.
We've got to move.
And John,
I know you want to get it. We have to move from this warrior model of policing. I try to take policing out of my lexicon. I talk about public safety. We have to move from the warrior model to the guardian model. You're part of the community. You're not an occupying force. And as John said, as you get to know the people in the neighborhood where you work, you realize that there actually aren't that many bad people in the community, even in crime-ridden neighborhoods. Most of the citizens are not involved in crime. It's a very small portion of the population.
Yeah, it's a crazily disproportionate small number of people who account for overwhelming amounts of violence. One of the initiatives when I was U.S. attorney in Killeen, which was our kind of violence hotbed in my district, was to just work with state authorities and take guys that the state authorities said were our top people who were causing all the violence and put federal charges on them however we could, even if it wouldn't ordinarily be a federal case, to just get them long sentences. And, you can never tell causation perfectly in these situations, but we did have a big drop in crime in Killeen by focusing on the bad actors and not kind of getting everybody in there.
Yeah, take them off the field.
Thanks. John, I do want to make sure that we focus on that neck of the woods again and look at immigration. While we know it does affect not only our border regions, but in much the same way that defund the police has been a Republican rallying cry of something that the Democrats did that they shouldn't have. In similar ways, we saw detainment of migrant children be a similar issue the Democrats have thrown on Republicans, especially in some of the border regions that you've worked so much in and that we know we saw in 2020 go much more heavily Republican. What kind of effects do you think, what are Republicans doing to try to, in a similar way, do something more proactive on immigration than the models that were so pilloried and that there was so much outcry against, especially among suburban women who saw in a lot of things similar children to their own? being detained. And how does the Republican Party look at, in a similar way, the Democrats are fighting back from their defund debacle? How are Republicans fighting back from their immigration missteps?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing on Republicans is they probably had better messages on their draconian policies because they didn't tout the parts that people didn't like as much as a slogan like defund the police does. I mean, they talk about big picture issues, protecting the border, stuff most people agree with. You know, you should only come in here legally and that kind of stuff. I mean, the problem to me, and I'll talk about the more specific policies, but the problem to me is that both sides talk about the border and immigration issues in very broad generalities that mask the very hard choices at the core of the policy. I mean, the reality is that we have tens and hundreds of millions of people who would like to come to this country, and many of whom can get here now. And it's easier and easier for people from far-flung places to get here. And we have to make hard choices. Unless you're going to let everybody in, you have to make hard choices among deserving people. Most of these people are not murderers and rapists. They're very poor people from countries that are very poorly run and very corrupt and have very high crime rates, and they would like to live here. That is what it is. And, you know, on the Republican side, I think we don't need to vilify people that are essentially throwing themselves at the mercy of our country and asking to live here. But on the Democrat side, you can't say every effort to enforce the immigration laws is cruel. I mean, in a sense, that's right. I mean, they are deserving, or at least people who are very sympathetic, and we're not going to let them all in. And at the point of enforcement, that's going to look cruel, because they're people who are not criminals. They're just poor people who want to live and work here. And no one really talks about the inherent, very difficult trade-offs in immigration policy on either side here. So it's very frustrating as someone that worked in it. They sort of like it all our immigration rhetoric has a feel of unreality to it, to me, about exactly what we're talking about. With respect to some of the Trump policies, you know, on the family separation, which was 6.5 weeks, the policy on its surface was, we're going to hold everyone accountable who crosses illegally. We're going to prosecute everyone who commits. It's a criminal offense under federal law to prosecute everyone who enters the country without authorization. For decades, since at least the Bush administration and throughout the Obama administration, virtually all single adults who crossed illegally were prosecuted. It varied a little bit by district based on court capacity, but there was essentially a zero tolerance policy for single adults, but that had not been extended to families. I assume for the reason that it was not clear how the system could handle children when the parents went to jail. The Trump administration under Attorney General Sessions decided that's not creating enough of a deterrent for families crossing, and we're creating bad incentives to bring children with you on these trips by essentially treating people who bring children much more laxly than we treat people who come as single adults. And so we're going to prosecute everyone. But as it's been revealed through all the reporting and OIG investigations since then, there was essentially no plan for tracking children and reuniting them with their parents. And the parents would be in prison or jail, really jail. They don't go to prison because the sentences are so short, for like 2 days or a week. These are misdemeanor offenses. And my view was, you know, you don't get a free pass if you commit a criminal offense just because you have a kid. Americans don't get that pass. But Americans who are prosecuted and they have kids are reunited with their kids immediately when they get out of jail. And they know where their kids are. And they're treated humanely in terms of how the kids are treated, what the parent knows about where the kid is, and so forth. And, you know, all the reporting I've seen shows that just did not happen. There was no planning. And you just cannot run an immigration policy by that. Even if you're someone like I am who supports very tough border enforcement, there is an upper bound to what you can do that's essentially our ideals of humane treatment of people, even people who are breaking the law. And it's not just a free-for-all that you can go to max enforcement without considering the way people are treated in this country. And you know, on some of those policies, that didn't happen. Really, the big Trump administration policy in terms of what was actually effective, whether you agree with it or not, was once the pandemic hit, the Trump administration invoked a public health authority under Title 42 of the U.S. Code to essentially bar everybody from entering. What that really means is they could be immediately deported without the normal hearings and process if they crossed illegally, as a public health measure. And that was upheld. The Biden administration has gotten rid of it, but that got held up in litigation. I'm not really sure what the status of that is. But whatever you think about that policy, that's in no way a long-term solution, because it was only legally justified because of the pandemic. So even if you're very hard line on these issues and very tough on border enforcement, which I think I generally am, at the end of the day, you need legislation to actually come up with a permanent solution, because no matter what President Trump or future President DeSantis potentially does, that can all be unwound by the next Democratic president immediately. And then you see what's happening now, which is a backlog of people who were held up during the last 2 years of Trump, all coming across the border. So, and I'll turn the floor over to the mayor, but we can talk later about what I see as some of the solutions that are actually long-term solutions that uphold our values on humane treatment, but also are effective in protecting our borders and making sure only people come here who are supposed to come here.
Well, you packed a lot in there, John. Sadly, even as John points out, the last Trump policy with the health hook because of the pandemic. I mean, even that, was viewed more as less about health and just one more tool to try to punish folks coming across. And they found, it's nothing convenient about the pandemic, but it was just one more thing that you can hang your hat on. I think you can't escape in a conversation like this. I mean, you can't escape what again appears like difference in treatment from folks who are south of us, many countries south of us. Mexico being the first obvious one, but many others below. People, walking with their children, 3,000 miles just to get to the United States of America. I mean, again, Lady Liberty must be crying. Send us your tired, send us your poor. And, in many instances, it almost feels like the United States has turned its back, a country of immigrants. Pretty much everyone except the American Indian population, Native population, everyone is an immigrant to the United States of America. Some came on their own, some did not come willingly. In any event, we're all here. And it just points out the disgrace, quite frankly, of a lack of a serious, real, workable, full immigration policy, not 50 different ones, across the United States of America, or whatever, this party wants to do, this president wants to do. We had a conversation about another topic that we can't seem to have a rational discussion about, and immigration seems to be one of those as well. If you're from the southern border of the United States, we want to do one thing. If you come from Europe and look like white people, then maybe we have another policy. And so, true or not, we all know that perception becomes reality, and that's how people are dealing with this. And so it just continues to flounder from administration to administration. At the end of the day, John he said a number of things I actually would agree with, but the vast majority of these folks, they are not criminals. They are not bringing disease. Everyone should get checked when they come into this country or any other country. They are fleeing death. I don't know a whole lot of us who would walk 3,500 miles from our house to go somewhere else in a country you've never been to, in a language you may not speak. You might not actually get in, but it is so bad where I was that I'm willing to take the chance to go to this other place. One, that says something about the greatness of the United States of America. And we, some days it's not our best day. But, all told, we still may be the best, one of the best places on the planet. And we politically, we just need to figure this out and treat people with dignity and humanity when they're seeking asylum here.
Absolutely. And I think as we come to a close, I'd just love to get both of your thoughts.
Not like we were on the Academy Awards or something. The music starts coming on.
We're gonna hook. Yeah. No, none of those in the virtual world, unless we've got somebody tucked in on an electronic image that we can get you on. But I'd love to hear from both of you. We've seen in the polls the last few weeks, we're seeing more looking like it's trending towards more Republican control of the Senate potentially, or a Republican held, and most likely a Republican held House. If that trend continues through Election Day and we see a divided government of a continued Democratic White House and a Republican Congress, or if we have the status quo remain in some form, what do both of you want businesses to know, and what do you think our corporate audiences should be most aware of as opportunities or as potential risks that they should be on the lookout for in where the energy is going to be in either a divided government or with the status quo?
I'm happy to start. Clearly with a divided government, the energy is going to be on regulations by administrative agencies from a business perspective, because they're going to get zero legislation of any significance done, unless it's on some sort of odd issue like Trump did criminal justice reform with Democrats. But on business issues, taxes, regulation, there's zero chance in a divided Biden presidency, Republican Congress, anything significant is going to get done, in my view. The Biden administration, I think they tried to get their big legislative proposals through as much as possible in the first 2 years, which is conventional and makes sense. But I think they will then turn to the agencies like the EPA and other administrative agencies to try to get policies done at an administrative level, because they're not going to have much confidence they're going to be able to do anything legislatively. The first year is going to be divided. The second year is going to be divided, plus election year, nothing significant is going to get done. Certainly the Republicans are going to launch a whole series of investigations, just as the Democrats did when Trump was in office and they had power. Remain to be seen what happens on those and whether they're effective or whether they turn anything up that will be politically damaging. But, I expect the action to be at the regulatory level. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a lawyer in private practice, but, companies that have issues with certain agencies are definitely going to want to talk to their legal counsel and, how can we influence legally, of course, how can you influence what the agency is going to do? Do we need to have litigation ready to challenge actions that are bad for our business? That's really, I think, where the action is going to be.
Well, and now for the Democratic response. Well, for our clients and the viewers, I mean, in a much more serious way, I mean, it's one of the reasons you're probably with EGA, Edelman Global Advisory. It's because we have a series and a set of relationships that work across the various aisles. So many of us can talk to so many different people. I might slightly disagree with John about nothing getting done. Maybe great big things won't get done, but people come to work every day. They introduce stuff. They actually vote from time to time, and so there are some things that will happen. And I think what's critical for us is to be at the forefront of those things and keep pushing that ball. Every now and then, you can actually hit pay dirt. Might not be the biggest thing in the world and the most monumental, but as they say, singles, doubles, and triples still move the players around the bases, and you can actually score some victories. So, again, with my optimistic hat, I have no idea what's going to happen next Tuesday. People talk about a divided government. It seems a little divided today, 50-50 in the Senate and pretty close margins in the House. And so that's a challenge with technically Democrats being in control. And so, John said something about President Biden earlier. I mean, he's got a little bit of experience over the years with all this kind of stuff. And if the Republicans do take over one of the chambers, then you might see more of him getting actively engaged and involved and using some of that 40 plus years of experience as a legislator.
Yeah, and I guess I should have said, the mayor's right. I don't think anything big is going to get done, but sure, every day there is legislation that impacts a particular sector that's not really that controversial and that flies under the radar. Surely that kind of work-a-day legislation will continue. I know I have a client right now that we're trying to get a technical fix to some statute that was passed last year that is impacting them. And so that's the kind of stuff that's nobody's going to be talking about that on the campaign trail, but it could be significant. So, that kind of stuff will get done. I mean, big tax reform, immigration reform, that kind of stuff's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we thank you all both so much for being with us today and for this conversation, and look forward to more insights to come from you all, and hopefully in the year to come and after the election. And again, just so appreciate the time and the conversation today. So thanks, Mayor Nutter and John.
That was very good. I very much enjoyed it. Have us back.
Yep.
Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye. Nice to meet you.